in which it's given, right? But not its monetary worth. Others gave out of their abundance, and they retained most of their wealth. Here, this woman gave out of her poverty. She gave everything she had, and so was extremely sacrificial. We might think of a story in the Old Testament with David. David at this time was the king in Israel, and he wanted to build an altar to the Lord and offer sacrifice to God, and he wanted to buy a field from this guy named Araunah, and Araunah sees the king, and he says, well, I'll just give it to you. I want to honor the king. And David says, no. He says, I will not offer burnt offerings to the Lord my God that cost me nothing. And he agrees to a fair price. He knew the importance of sacrificing. And so we might make that application. A third thing we might say is, God accepts what is given in faith. God would have rejected the large amounts of money that the rich were putting in because of their heart, right? But this widow, he sees her heart. Here's this woman, she's actually in need of charity herself, and yet she's being charitable. And in giving everything, she's trusting that God can use those 2 small copper coins for something. And she's trusting that God is going to keep providing for her. I don't know what was going through her head, but it could be that she was thinking about another widow in the Old Testament. A widow from the town of Zarephath who was trying to care for her younger son. And the prophet came, Elijah, and she gave her last meal to Elijah in 1 Kings chapter 17. And maybe she believed, like that widow, that as God provided for her and her son in Elijah's day, he would provide for her in Jesus' day. So we may reach the conclusion from this text that we should give like this widow gave. Now, these principles are all true. These are good lessons to learn. God does see what others overlook. God does value what other people disparage. He does accept what is given in faith, and he will provide for his people. The Bible teaches all of that. But this might not be the text to use to teach these things. Let's dig a little bit deeper. I want to note what comes before and after it to help us understand what's going on here. Look at the section just before it. Verses 38 to 40. In his teaching, he said, beware of the scribes who like to walk around in long robes and like greetings in the marketplace and have the best seats in the synagogues and the places of honor at feasts, who devour widows' houses and for a pretense make long prayers. They will receive the greater condemnation. So Matthew, he gives a more detailed account of Jesus' rebuke of the scribes, and he lumps them in with the Pharisees, Matthew chapter 23. But Luke and Mark, they give kind of a condensed version of this in their accounts. And they're basically making the same point. The scribes and the widows, they occupied opposite ends of the social spectrum in Jewish society. Scribes, they were teachers of the law, interpreters of the law, and they sat near the top. And the widows, to whom God expresses particular care, along with orphans and foreigners in the law of Moses, they sat at the bottom. And what Jesus says to his disciples is, you need to beware of the example of the scribes. He gives some reasons here. Basically, he shows that these people were just concerned with appearances, right? They were, they had perfected the art of virtue signaling. They did it with their clothes. The kind of robes that they were wearing, it's a particular word he uses here, a special kind of robe that extended all the way down to your feet. And to be worn by important people, kings and priests and people of distinction, that kind of thing. And so the clothes signified the man. And so the scribes' robes, these long robes, well, that meant that they were people of honor, they were people of status, they were actually people of education, and they were people of leisure. Because you don't wear long, flowing, decorative robes to go work out in the field, do you? Regular people wore regular kind of clothes. They wore a little bit shorter robes, more practical kind of stuff like that. And the scribes were then flaunting their piety with their wardrobe. And looking at Matthew's parallel to this, in Matthew chapter 23 and verse 5, Jesus says, Matthew 23 and verse 5, he says, they do all their deeds to be seen by others. They make their phylacteries broad and their fringes long. Phylactery is like a box with a scroll of prayers rolled up in it, and they wear it on their heads, and they wear it proudly, and these fringes on their garments, extra long, had some kind of symbolic significance. But the point is, they're signaling their importance and their holiness through their clothes. Same thing with their titles. The marketplace. They like these greetings in the marketplace. Well, the marketplace is sort of the center of public life, is where everyone hung out. And in an honor-shame culture like ancient Judea, greetings were not these casual kind of things. They were offered a kind of social currency. So people would publicly acknowledge a person's status in the marketplace with a title like teacher, rabbi, master, or lord, or father. They were older. And so meeting someone in the marketplace was kind of like a mini public ceremony of recognition. And Jesus says, well, these scribes, they craved that kind of thing, that visible, verbal, repeated affirmation of their importance and their authority. They love that kind of stuff. And what does Jesus say about wearing religious titles and craving that kind of attention? Well, again, back in Matthew 23, the kind of parallel to this, he says, they love these greetings in the marketplaces, being called rabbi by others, teacher. But you're not to be called rabbi, Jesus says, for you have one teacher, and you're all brothers. And call no man your father on earth, for you have one Father who's in heaven. Neither be called instructors, for you have one instructor, the Christ. The greatest among you shall be your servant. Whoever exalts himself will be humbled, and whoever humbles himself will be exalted. So they signal their virtue with their titles. They love the best seats. Right? Seating at public events conveyed rank. The most honored guests would sit at the front where everyone could see them. Right? Next to the host of the party. In synagogues, the best seats were reserved for people of spiritual influence in the community. It signified moral prestige. The best seats of a banquet, that signaled social prestige. You were important in the community. And the fact is that they sought the best seats in the house, and Jesus says that actually betrays their self-inflated view. He tells a story to his disciples in Luke chapter 14. He says, when you get invited to a party, don't assume that the best seats are for you. Don't go to the front of the room and sit down. How embarrassing would it be if the host had to come and say, hey, sorry, fella, someone more important has come along. Can you sit back here? No, sit at the back. Better to be sitting at the back and have to get moved up than assume that you're the most important person and have to get moved back. So they love the best seats. And then their prayers. Rather than sincerely seeking the face of God in their prayers, they really viewed their prayers as an opportunity to display their biblical knowledge and their devotion to God. And Jesus calls all these lengthy, eloquent prayers a performative sham, a pretense, a tool to impress other people, but really to mask their own spiritual corruption. As we talked about this morning, nothing wrong with long prayers. Jesus prayed long prayers himself, but the example prayer that Jesus gave in the Sermon on the Mount is rather short, right? And he says that if you really believe in prayer, if you really believe that God is listening, well then go and pray behind a closed door. And don't do it just in front of people to impress them. Then there's their greed. Do you notice that back in Mark chapter 12? In verse 40, what else they do? These scribes, they devour widows' houses. Now, I find that interesting considering the next story, which involves a widow who had nothing but 2 coins. So widows were, again, among the most vulnerable people in Israelite society. Again, along with orphans and foreigners, they were to be given special care in their community. Widows didn't have any kind of steady income. They were completely dependent upon either surviving family members, or if they didn't have any, their neighbors. And how are the scribes guilty of devouring widows' houses? Well, the Bible doesn't actually tell us exactly how, but we might surmise a little bit. Because the scribes were experts in the law of Moses, they were often consulted as legal advisors. And since the law was a civil law as well as a moral law, it guided Israelites on things like property disputes, things like inheritance rights, or financial obligations, what to devote to God and stuff. So the scribes would be the people that you go to talk about these things. What does the law of Moses say about this? And so the scribes could have been estate managers with access to the financial affairs of widows. And so to devour widows' houses, that's a visceral kind of image, isn't it? That suggests a systemic exploitation of these widows, possibly through mishandling their estates, maybe through charging excessive legal fees, or perhaps by manipulating pious giving. You know what I mean by that? Encouraging donations to the temple beyond one's means. This idea of you've got to give till it hurts. And I put an asterisk there, I think with the proximity of the widow's offering here, in verses 41 to 44, this is the best option. But either way, the scribes are not merely just vain, they're predatory. They're using religion to exploit the most defenseless people in their community. And it's the exact opposite of what James tells us pure and undefiled religion before God is. Pure and undefiled religion before God is keeping oneself unstained from the world, being morally pure, and visiting orphans and widows in their affliction, making sure that they're taken care of. And that's why Jesus pronounces judgment on them. If you look back at the last phrase there in verse 40, they will receive the greater condemnation. It's rather ironic. Instead of receiving the greater wealth and honor in society, which they were seeking, they're going to receive the greater condemnation from God. And you see the contrast between the scribes and the widow. The widow probably didn't own any fancy robes, did she? She was probably more concerned with affording food at the marketplace than receiving special greetings there. And she probably didn't get invited to many banquets, let alone get offered the best seats at them. So while the scribes kind of fancied themselves the spiritual leaders and the important members of society, to God's view, it was people like this self-sacrificial widow who were the real spiritual backbone of Israel. They were the faithful ones. They were the ones who were living by example. And this condemnation is reinforced by what comes after the story of the widow's offering. So we fast forward to chapter 13 and verses 1 and 2. As he came out of the temple, one of his disciples said to him, "Look, teacher, what wonderful stones, what wonderful buildings." Jesus said to him, "Do you see these great buildings? There will not be left here one stone upon another that will not be thrown down." So as they're leaving the temple, the disciples remark on the beauty of this complex, and indeed it was beautiful. Herod the Great, this was his baby, his construction project to enlarge and refurbish and beautify the temple. It took decades, 46 years to complete, and the result was impressive. He employed 1,000 priests as stonemasons and carpenters so as not to profane the temple grounds as they were building. And these stones were gigantic, 3 to 5 ton stones. Most of them, some of them, were as large as 40 feet long and 10 feet high, 10 feet wide. They weighed 500 tons on this western retaining wall. Massive walls, massive building project, concentric, multi-tiered courts, and even a gold-plated facade on the eastern side of the temple. Listen to what Josephus, a guy who lived a little bit after this, said. "The exterior of the building wanted nothing that could astound either mind or eye, for being covered on all sides with massive plates of gold, the sun no sooner rose than it radiated so fiery a flash, it made those who forced themselves to look upon it to turn their eyes away, just as they would have done the sun's own rays." Very impressive. And so the disciples are saying, "Look at this, Jesus. Isn't this a blessing? What a wonderful place to worship God." And what does Jesus say? It's going to be utterly destroyed. All of this is going to be torn down. Haggai, he was the prophet who was living when the second temple was actually being constructed. He described the construction of the temple as, quote, "stone placed upon stone." And Jesus describes its destruction as no stone being left upon another. Now, why would God abandon and unmake such an impressive structure dedicated to his glory? Well, because just like the religious hypocrites who ran the temple was beautiful on the outside, but it was rotten on the inside. The temple had become a monument to religious corruption and hypocrisy. And the story of the widow's offering was just one example of that. The treasury was managed in such a way that it actually fed off the weakest people in society. Instead of being cared for, the widows were being devoured, eaten alive. Not only was God being robbed of his glory, but his people were being trampled. And that's why the temple could not stand. He is the father of the fatherless, the protector of widows, is God in his holy habitation. What happens when that habitation is desecrated with hypocrisy and greed? Well, it has to be torn down. So we look at this text in its context. I think it helps us to see a wider view of what's going on here. The lesson isn't so much be like the widow as it is don't be like the scribes. Don't be like the hypocrites who give to be seen and who not only neglect the poor but perpetuate a system which actually preys upon them. So let's end with just a couple of practical kind of things that we need to watch out for. The first thing is examine your practice of giving. We always need to be examining our practices, don't we? Why do we do the things that we do? And we need to ask that question when we're being generous. Why do we give? Well, we talked about this morning in our Bible class in Matthew chapter 6. We ought not to give for attention and the praise of men, but nor should we give out of pressure and guilt and manipulation. Right? The widow has a sincere heart, extremely humble. She loves God, and there's no doubting that. But was it God's will that she give all that she had to live on and be left completely destitute with nothing? Was that God's will? You say, well, Jesus, he told the rich young ruler to sell all that he has. That is true. But was that a universal command? Or was that something that guy needed to hear? Was it designed to expose his idolatry? And then, what did Jesus add? Sell all that you have and do what with it? Give to the poor and come and follow me. The temple treasury was important. The temple treasury, it paid for sacrifices and the priests and the maintenance of the temple. There's some scriptures on the board there, but so was caring for widows. Those are both important covenant responsibilities. And something is seriously wrong with the system when rich people are dumping money into the temple treasury, and widows who ought to be receiving care feel obligated to give the little that they possess. There's a real disparity there, a real imbalance on display in the court of the women in the temple treasury. So we need to examine our practice. The second thing we should consider is our resources. Consider your resources. Now, in the New Testament, we're not commanded to tithe. In the Old Testament, they were commanded to tithe, to give a tenth of what they had. We're not given any kind of proportion like that, any kind of percentage like that in the New Testament, but we are commanded to give generously and to care for God's people. Lots of verses teach that. For example, when famine struck Judea, Paul saw it as an opportunity for the Gentile Christians to give some of what they had to help the Jewish Christians in Jerusalem. And so he organized a collection from churches in Macedonia, churches like the one in Philippi, and Achaia, churches like Corinth. Now, the Corinthians had already promised to be a part of this relief effort, and you can see Paul in his first letter to the Corinthians giving them some instructions. 1 Corinthians chapter 16, verse 1 says, "Now concerning the collection for the saints, as I directed the churches of Galatia, so also you are to do. On the first day of the week, each of you is to put something aside and store it up, as he may prosper, so that there will be no collecting when I come." And so he gives them some instructions there. But in the interim between 1 Corinthians and 2 Corinthians, the church at Corinth had not made good on their promise. They were not storing up this collection, and Paul had heard about it. They weren't following through. And so he writes 2 Corinthians. Turn over there with me, 2 Corinthians in chapter 8. And so what does Paul do? Well, he's going to remind them of their obligation. Now, you guys said you were going to do this. You need to follow through with what you said you would do. And he points out at the beginning of the chapter the Macedonians. And the Macedonians were a lot like this widow that we read about. Paul says that they gave out of their poverty. They gave beyond their means. And Paul says that he didn't even ask them to do that. In fact, they had to beg Paul for the opportunity to do this. And so Paul couldn't say no. Now that was very noble. But what Paul says in the next verses here, he emphasizes that giving should be proportional to what you have. Take a look at verse 10 to 15. He says, "And in this matter I give my judgment. This benefits you, who a year ago started not only to do this work of collecting money and stuff, but also to desire to do it. So now finish doing it as well, so that your readiness in desiring it may be matched by your completing it out of what you have. For if the readiness is there, it's acceptable according to what a person has, not according to what a person does not have. For I do not mean that others should be eased and you burdened, but as a matter of fairness, your abundance at the present time should supply their need, so that their abundance may supply your need, that there may be fairness. As it is written, whoever gathered much had nothing left over, whoever gathered little had no lack." So in the economy of God's kingdom here, there's always enough to go around when his people are generous towards each other. And Paul didn't want the Corinthians to be burdened, to be made poor through their giving. That's not what he's saying. He wanted fairness or equity. That right now they're doing fine. They're not suffering through a famine. They have an abundance. And at the present moment, their abundance could supply the Judeans' need. And you could understand the implication of that. Hey, guys, when a famine strikes Achaia, the Judean Christians are going to remember how generous you were, and they're going to want to help out too. So generosity isn't about impoverishing yourself, but sharing what God has given you. So when you give, you should ask yourself, what has God entrusted to me? And ask, am I able to give? God doesn't ask us to give what we do not have. He doesn't call us to neglect our own needs in the name of generosity. Look, there are times we're going to be able to give, and there are times when we actually may need to be supported. And both of those are part of God's design for the local church. For example, in 1 Timothy chapter 5, Paul talks about the proper care of widows in the church. And there's a procedure that has to go on, that has to take place there. So, yes, we must give sacrificially. We ought to give cheerfully. But we also need to give thoughtfully and proportionally. So consider your resources. And then one more thing to consider is we need to be aware of our susceptibility. Who does Jesus condemn here? Well, they're not pagans, are they? They're not unbelievers. These are religious people who ostensibly want to serve God, right? The scribes and the Pharisees. These are teachers of the law. But they've become so corrupt that they twisted that law to serve themselves. And they were condemned for it. Now, do you think the same thing could happen to you and me? I mean, why is it in the Bible? If not to warn us that this can happen to religious people. God forbid that we would ever use godliness as a tool for personal gain, or use spiritual language to mask material ambition. All of our hearts are susceptible to the same temptations if left unchecked. And the love of money is the root of all kinds of evil. And we need to take special care of our vulnerable members here at Dulles and not let anything get in the way of our financial obligations to them. With that being said, we live in one of the richest counties in America, don't we? And I think we read a story like this, and we really, if we're being honest, we identify more with the rich than we do with the poor. And so Paul has a word to the rich. And he's not trying to guilt them. It's not a sin to be wealthy. But he does encourage them with the truth. He says, "As for the rich in this present age, charge them not to be haughty, nor to set their hopes on the uncertainty of riches, but on God, who richly provides us with everything to enjoy. They are to do good, and to be rich in good works, thus to be generous and ready to share, thus storing up treasure for themselves as a good foundation for the future, so that they may take hold of that which is truly life. And that which is truly life cannot be bought. It's a thing of grace that's given to us. And let's not forfeit that by trusting in the uncertainty of riches. Again, it's no crime to be wealthy, but may God protect us from greed and impurity and hypocrisy, and shape within us hearts that reflect the generosity and the wisdom of Christ. If you need to respond to the grace that God has given you, then we leave that opportunity open for you right now. In a minute, Jim is going to lead us in a song called Seek Ye First. Seek ye first the kingdom of God and his righteousness, and he'll take care of you. He'll make sure that you have all your needs met. And when you seek God first, God adopts you into his family, where there's accountability, where there's love, and where people take care of you. And so if you want to become a Christian, or you need the prayers of this church, if there's a way that we can help you spiritually, then why don't you come forward right now as we stand up and sing together.